What I am going to focus on today is the big question of why. Why some people are more at risk for developing substance use problems than others. So we know that many people are able to drink or use drugs socially without developing problems. So why for others does it go on to take over their lives? And we know that substance use disorders are incredibly complex. There is no one easy answer to this, that they're influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. So in the environment, things that many of you who work in this area are probably very familiar with, found in our families, schools, neighborhoods, peers. But genetics also plays a large role in why some people are more at risk than others. And so we know that the heritability of substance use disorders is somewhere around 50 to 60%, meaning that around half of the differences that we see in why some people drink more, use more drugs, go on to develop problems is due to differences in the sequences in their DNA. And then the other half is due to differences in our environments. And very often, when we are thinking about prevention, intervention, treatment, we are focused on the environmental side for very good reason. Obviously, there's important pieces that are critical to recovery found in having supportive family environments, peer networks, stable housing, and other kinds of critical pieces of a supportive community. But we are very often ignoring this other piece of the puzzle. And substance use disorders are so incredibly complex to treat, to address, to understand, that I think we want to use all the tools in our toolbox. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is really how we can think about incorporating that other part of the puzzle when we're thinking about prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery. So today I'm going to give an update on what we have learned about genetic influences on addiction. And then I'm going to talk about how we can use that information both in the future and right now to help improve our ability to prevent, to treat, and to support individuals in their recovery. So we know both genes and environmental factors are important, but we also know there is no gene for any particular psychiatric or substance use outcome. There is no gene for alcohol use disorder, or opioid use disorder, or depression, or cardiovascular disease, or any of these complex outcomes. Instead, what we know is that there are thousands of genetic variants, each of which just play a small role on their own, some of which increase risk, some of which decrease risk. And so if we want to understand an individual's genetic liability or vulnerability toward developing a substance use disorder, we need to take into account information across the genome. And the way that we sometimes conceptualize this, with full credit to one of my colleagues and dear friends, Janine Austin, who actually spoke at this conference some years back. She is the world's leading psychiatric genetic counselor. And she uses the analogy of mental health jars. We all have a mental health jar. And if you can imagine, when that jar is full, that is when someone is actively experiencing problems, a substance use disorder, maybe a depression diagnosis, schizophrenia. And so what are the things that can fill up our jar that can lead to problems? Well, there's genetic factors, which are shown here with these little yellow marbles, and there's environmental risk factors, shown here with these little orange triangles. And those can go in the jar to start contributing to risk and making some individuals more likely to develop problems. And the reality is that we all carry some genetic risk for substance use disorders. In fact, we know that genetic risk is distributed like a bell curve in the population. So there are some individuals who carry low risk. They're lucky enough to be born with not a lot of risk variance. There are some individuals who unfortunately start life with an unlucky draw of the genetic lottery. They carry an elevated risk for substance use disorders. And then there are lots of us that fall somewhere in the middle. And you can see this through our mental health jar heuristic, where if you're at low risk, you might just have a small number of genetic variants. If you're at high risk, your jar already might be partly full. You have a lot of genetic variants that you are already beginning life with. But hopefully this also shows that no one is born with a destiny to develop a substance use disorder. In fact, what happens is that over time, we all start with our genetic liability, and then we might accumulate environmental risk factors. We're all likely to accumulate some of them over the course of our lifetime, some of us more than others. And so, for example, you can see that this in the top jar there, they're starting life with a lower genetic risk, but over time, they might accumulate a lot of environmental stressors, a lot of environmental challenges, and that leads to their jar being full, to developing a substance use disorder. On the other hand, if you start life with a higher number of genetic risk factors, your jar is already closer to the top. It doesn't take as much environmental risk before you're experiencing problems. So this can hopefully help understand this abstract concept of how our genes and our environmental factors come together to contribute to why some individuals are more likely to develop problems. But hopefully it also makes clear how both prevention and recovery are possible. So if you imagine that on the far left side, that's the jar of someone who is actively experiencing challenges. They might actively be meeting criteria for a substance use disorder. We can both remove environmental risk factors. We can take out some of those orange triangles such that they might still have some risk, but they're not actively experiencing problems. And the other thing that we can do is we can layer on protective factors, which we visualize here as essentially adding rims to the top of the jar, making it taller so you can take more risk before you actually are experiencing problems. And those protective factors are things like supportive environments, like family factors, supportive peer networks in our communities, good sleep, healthy nutrition, etc. So when it comes to any one individual, it's the combination of their unique genetic risk profile and the environments they've experienced that lead to why they might have developed a substance use problem. And of course, everyone's jar is going to look different. And in fact, I said earlier that there are thousands of genetic risk variants that impact why some people are more likely to develop a substance use problem. You don't need to have all of those. You don't need to be carrying all of those genetic risk factors to be at elevated risk. You might just have some of them, which also means different people might have different genetic risk factors. And so what this shows here is that both of these individuals have a high genetic loading. They are carrying a lot of genetic risk, but the different colored marbles are indicating different genetic risk factors. So they're carrying different genes that are making them more at risk. And of course, this maps onto what we see clinically. People report using substances for very different reasons. There's a lot of heterogeneity. There are a lot of differences in the individuals who come in for treatment. And essentially, what scientists like myself are doing right now is we are working on scanning the genome to identify the specific genes involved in risk for substance use disorders. And essentially, when we do that, we are genotyping markers all across the genome. So each one of these little arrows represents an area in the genome where there's genetic variation. So you might have one version, I might have another version at that particular locus in the genome. There are, in fact, millions of locations where we all differ. And what we do is we scan millions of markers all the way across the genome. And gene finding at its simplest is simply looking at, are individuals who are affected more likely to carry a particular version at that location in the genome than individuals who are unaffected, or individuals who are higher on a particular trait, more likely to have a particular variant than individuals who are lower. And the whole idea of doing these gene identification studies is that by identifying the specific genes across the genome that are involved in substance use disorder risk, it can both help us understand the underlying biology, and that can be used in pharmaceutical development with the goal of hopefully improving our ability to treat substance use disorders. But in addition, by identifying these genetic risk factors, it can help us also understand who is at elevated risk. And ideally, we want to be able to use this information for prevention and earlier intervention. And this is the basis for the Precision Medicine Initiative. So by show of hands, how many of you all are familiar with or have heard of the Precision Medicine Initiative? So just a few. In the world of science, this is all we talk about. This is a massive focus at the National Institutes of Health. So it was first announced by President Obama in 2015 in his State of the Union address. And the whole idea is, right now, when do most of us go to the doctor? When we're sick, when something is wrong. And do you rush right out to the doctor the second something seems a little bit off? No. We wait, we see if it resolves on its own, we see if we can fix it on our own, and then when it gets worse, then we go into the doctor. And of course, that's what we see as well for individuals who are seeking treatment for substance use disorders. Often, they are at a more advanced, severe stage by the time, if they actually make it into treatment. The idea behind precision medicine is that our genotypes contain a tremendous amount of information about what we are more at risk for. All of us are at risk for something. Some of us are more at risk for cardiovascular disease, others of us for cancers, and some of us for psychiatric and substance use disorders. And so the whole idea is that by harnessing this information, we can move medicine from a treatment-based model. We show up when something is wrong, and then we have a bunch of trial and error to figure out what might work for this person. It's incredibly costly to the individual who's suffering, to their family, to our healthcare system. Instead, we should be able to move medicine to a system that is preventative, predictive, and personalized. And that is where we're trying to go with all of this basic research. The Precision Medicine Initiative was actually signed into law the following year, 2016. It had strong bipartisan support. Remember those days, back when that happened? This was something everyone could agree on, that we need to improve our ability to treat and prevent health conditions. There's over $1.5 billion going into the Precision Medicine Initiative over the next 10 years. Much of it is focused on the All of Us program. This is an ongoing study. VCU is actually one of the data collection sites where individuals are being invited to participate from across the country. And we are collecting a wealth of information, medical information, health records, genetic information, biomarkers, wearables, sensors, essentially a whole host of information for individuals who want to be a part. There's a big emphasis on making sure that diverse populations are included in this study, so everyone will benefit from the results. And this study, which is being launched in the US with the attempt to recruit 1 million and more individuals, joins many other countries that are already ahead of us in having hundreds of thousands of individuals with genetic information and health-related information in biobanks that are being used for health research and then to feed back in to the medical system. And so, for example, the UK has over 500,000 people that we regularly use in our research. Finland as well, Iceland. So the United States is also collecting this massive sample. And so what will we do with all of this data? the whole idea is to use big data analytics, so the same things that the big companies are using to essentially feed you those targeted advertisements where you do a Google search for something and next thing you know, you have ads popping up constantly for it, to essentially use big data to improve healthcare. So the idea is that there will be better classification and diagnosis, and this will allow us to do better prevention and intervention. And so in a paper that was published in Science, kind of the premier biomedical journal, by one of the former directors of the National Institutes of Mental Health, he essentially talks about how right now, the individuals who are in treatment for substance use disorders and psychiatric outcomes are an incredibly mixed bag. This is the complexity that you all are dealing with in your clinics and in your treatment centers. We can collect information about all of these relevant dimensions. We know individuals differ in their genetic risk, they differ in brainwave activity and physiology, in their behavior, in their environmental factors. And so the whole idea is by collecting data from millions of individuals, what we can then do is identify these more homogeneous clusters, so we can identify individuals who have a substance use disorder through a similar pathway. They have arrived at there because of a shared biology or environmental set of risk factors, and that should allow us to do more targeted intervention that will be more effective for that group of individuals. And so they essentially make this bold declaration that new diagnostics will redefine mental health and addictive disorders as brain circuit disorders. And new pharmaceutical treatments and behavioral interventions can fine-tune those circuits. Now, if at this point you are thinking that this seems like pure science fiction, a very interesting idea, but something that's never really going to come to pass, I want to take you back less than 30 years ago when they were talking about this crazy thing called the internet on the Today Show.
Back in 56 past, I wasn't prepared to translate that as I was doing that little tease.
Oh, that's
that little
right.
mark with the A and then the ring around it.
At?
See, that's what I said. Katie said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
But I'd never heard it.
Around
I'd never heard it
or
said.
about.
I'd always seen the
Approximately.
mark, but never heard
Yeah.
it said. And then it sounded stupid when I said it. Violence at NBC.
Yeah, I heard
around
big
or
fight
about.
in the lunchroom the other
See,
week.
there it is. Violence at NBC. GE com. I mean,
Well, Allison should know.
what
do you
is
say to that,
internet
Allison?
anyway?
Internet is that
Massive computer
right,
network.
the one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what internet is?
So let's take a minute to think about that. Less than 30 years ago, .com, the internet, what is that? I think it's something that those researchers are talking about and using. Fast forward just a few decades, we of course now have an entire generation that's growing up never knowing a world before they had access to everything at their fingertips. It has changed the way that we vote, the way we interact with one another. It's changed the way that our kids are growing up in ways that nobody was thinking about or predicting less than 30 years ago. What made these advances possible is something that's called Moore's Law. Moore's Law is named for Intel's co-founder, Gordon Moore, who in the 60s observed that the amount of transistors they could put on a square inch of computing space was doubling every year. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Exponential growth. What is shown on this graph, that white line right there is showing Moore's law, how fast things were advancing in computing. It looks like a line because if you look at the y-axis, it's an exponential axis. It's going from 1 million to 10 million to 100 million, and that's why Moore's law looks like a linear line. But the reason it is on that scale is to show you, for comparison, that is the rate at which computer technology advanced. That is what made that amazing jump from what is the internet to today possible. Our brains evolved to think linearly. The idea of exponential growth is not something that our brains are good at. Now, what is shown here in green is the pace at which genotyping technology is advancing. It is outpacing Moore's law. Consider that the first human genome, one human genome, was sequenced. That sequence was released in 2003. It took $3 billion and 13 years to sequence one human genome. Today, it costs $100 and it can be done in under an hour. Genotyping, genetics, is the only field who's advancing at a pace that outpaces, that exceeds the growth we have seen in the computing industry. It's just that our exponential growth curve has started about 40 years after the exponential growth curve of computing. So think about what that could mean for us in terms of genetics and the way that we use it and incorporate it in another 30 years. Consider it wasn't even until the 50s that we even understood the double helix structure of DNA. Shown here is the famous picture of Watson and Crick, who went on to win the Nobel Prize. The structure of DNA, little known fact, was actually first identified by a woman, Rosalind Franklin, whose male senior advisor showed her work to Watson and Crick, who then went on and published it and subsequently won the Nobel Prize. She has been largely erased from history. Sadly, the technique she was using was an X-ray technique to see the DNA structure. She subsequently died of cancer, radiation, and so her advisor and the two of them were awarded the Nobel Prize. So little aside there in terms of medical history. But the key piece here is this was the 50s and the 60s that we even just discovered the structure of DNA. Now, genetic testing companies are everywhere, right? 23andMe, Myriad Genetics, Ancestry.com. It is a $20 billion industry today, expected to be a $40 billion industry by the end of this decade. There is exponential growth in the number of individuals who are accessing their personalized genetic information. Not only that, but you can download your raw genotypic data from 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you can upload it to free publicly available websites. ImputeMe was one of the most popular ones. Interestingly, this was the screenshot from its homepage, and you could get your genetic risk score for over 1,500 medical conditions. This little graph down here shows that there was exponential growth in people who were accessing their own personal genetic risk scores as well. And guess what? ImputeMe is not available now because it was commercially purchased. Turns out, when we could get the information from it, alcohol use disorder was the third most requested genetic risk score out of more than 1,500 medical conditions. Psychiatric and substance use disorders made up half of the top 12 most requested genetic risk scores. People want this information, and they're already getting it. So I'm going to switch to talking a little bit about where the science is as of today. So I lead a large international consortia, which is focused on finding genes, advancing gene identification for substance use disorders and related outcomes. This is a paper that we had come out in Nature Neuroscience just over a year ago. These are the key players who were involved in this work. It included data from 1.5 million individuals. And going back to that technique, what we were doing is essentially scanning the genome and then identifying the genetic variants that were associated with an elevated risk of substance use and other sorts of addictive disorders. We then sum up all of those variants that are associated, thousands of them across the genome, and that creates what is sometimes called a PGS, or a polygenic score. And then what you can do is take those polygenic scores into an independent sample, and you can calculate for every individual, every one of us here, what your polygenic score is toward addiction, and then ask, what do those individuals look like? What is this genetic risk associated with? And so to orient you to this graph, essentially what we have done here is we have divided genetic risk scores, which are distributed like a bell curve in the population, right? Some individuals with low risk, some individuals with high risk, lots of folks in the middle. And we divided that into quintiles. So at the far left side are individuals who have the lowest levels of genetic risk scores. Over here are individuals who have the highest levels of genetic risk. And what this graph is showing is in these independent samples with thousands of individuals, individuals at the lowest level of genetic risk, for example, looking at that top line, about 30% of them developed a moderate or severe alcohol use disorder, as compared to individuals at the highest levels of genetic risk, where about 50% of them went on to develop an alcohol use disorder. Similarly, if you look at, for example, ever used opioids, and this is opioids without a doctor's prescription in ways that were not intended by the medical community, about 12% of individuals at low genetic risk, about 30% of individuals at high genetic risk. But it turns out that these genetic risk scores are not just associated with substance use outcomes, they're also associated with a host of other kinds of behavioral and biomedical outcomes. And so, for example, we know that many of these genes are genes that are involved in the way that our brains process risk and reward, rewards and consequences. And so to the extent that some individuals have brains that are more primed toward more impulsive action, toward more reward seeking, toward kind of the here and now, as opposed to brains that immediately start thinking about, ooh, what would be the long-term consequences of that? Well, these genetic risk scores you can see are also associated with things like having been arrested, having been convicted of a crime, childhood behavior problems, adult antisocial behavior. And I should mention here that all of the individuals who went into these analyses were all individuals who self-reported as white and who were of European ancestry. And so I mention that just because the racism that exists in our criminal justice system is not coming into play in this particular analysis. In addition, individuals who are carrying lower levels of genetic risk are far more likely to graduate from college. Individuals at higher levels of genetic risk are more likely to initiate sex at an early age. They're more likely to have been fired from a job. The reason I mention all of this is because what it clearly shows is that when we are thinking about genetic risk that influence substance use disorders and other psychiatric outcomes, we need to understand that these aren't genes specifically for those outcomes. We also took these genetic risk scores into one of these large biobanks. This happens to be a biobank located at Vanderbilt, where they have de-identified, but we can create genetic risk scores and then ask in their electronic health records, individuals who are carrying higher levels of genetic risk, what sorts of biomedical outcomes are associated with that? And I know that you can't see all of these different dots or read them. The intention is not for you to be able to, but just to note that all of these little dots on the far right side are medical outcomes that are associated with elevated levels of genetic risk. And the key part here is that individuals who are carrying higher genetic risk show worse health in virtually every bodily system. So it's not just substance use disorders, but they're also more likely to suffer from heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cirrhosis of the liver, lung cancer. And of course, what you immediately notice is that these are medical outcomes that are related to self-regulation behaviors, drinking too much, using too many drugs, eating too much, risky sexual behavior. Our brains are all wired differently. And some of us have brains that are wired more toward risk-taking behavior. And it manifests in a whole host of biomedical outcomes. And I mention this because I think it is really critical that we rethink this idea of genetic risk for substance use disorders. Individuals are not carrying genes that just put them at risk for an alcohol use disorder or an opioid use disorder. Instead, what they're carrying are genetic risk that has influenced the way their brain is wired, and that influences risk for a host of substance and psychiatric outcomes, substance use and psychiatric outcomes, as well as other biomedical outcomes. And so I find that one of the biggest misconceptions is that people increasingly understand there are genetic influences on substance use disorders and why some people are more at risk, but that they tend to think that those are genes that are involved in physiology, in how the body responds to a particular drug. That if I am carrying particular genes, if I try a certain drug, I'm much more likely to become addicted to it. And there's a little bit of truth in that. There are certainly genes that influence the way our bodies respond to and metabolize drugs, and that can make some individuals more at risk than others. This appears to be particularly true in the case of opioid use disorders, I'll mention. But it turns out that the other ways that our genes influence risk for substance use disorders, in fact, the biggest risk pathway is through what I have been talking about with this study I was just mentioning. It's not related to just how our bodies process a drug. It's related to how our brains process rewards and consequences. And so we know that one of the biggest risk pathways is what we sometimes call the externalizing pathway. And this is related to things that show up as impulsivity and sensation-seeking, risk-taking. Some of us have brains that are more prone towards that than others. We also know that another genetically influenced risk pathway is what's sometimes called internalizing. And so this is related to how our brains process fear and anxiety. Some of us are more prone toward negative thinking and depressive tendencies, toward anxiety proneness. Substances then can get used as a way to cope with those feelings. So in fact, these are three different genetically influenced pathways that can elevate risk for substance use disorders. They're not mutually exclusive. Individuals can carry risk across one or many of them. But by understanding that this is how our genes are influencing these outcomes, hopefully you can also start to think about how we can use that for prevention. Because one of the fascinating things and encouraging things, if you're thinking about it from a prevention perspective, about substance use disorders is that no one wakes up one morning and says, oh my gosh, I've had an onset of alcohol use disorder overnight. The development of problems is usually preceded by a trajectory of risk-related behavior. And so, for example, we know that impulsivity shows up in little kids like this. It's the child that is dangling from the tops of trees, that's giving parents a heart attack, that's ending up in the ER a lot. We know that this child, if you fast forward a decade, is far more likely to be this individual. But not necessarily. There's no reason that that same impulsive, risk-taking, novelty-seeking disposition can't be channeled into this or into this. And for full disclosure, those who know me know that this is actually my little risk taker who comes by it very honestly His father, my brother are all, in fact, fighter pilots. Which brings us to another important point, which is that being a risk taker is not in and of itself a bad thing. CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots are all higher on risk taking. We're not trying to eliminate impulsive or risk taking behavior, but it does put individuals at elevated risk. And so we should be able to harness that information. And so, while it is absolutely critical to focus on environmental components as part of treatment and recovery, so I want to make very clear that no one comes away with the idea that I'm saying that those are not absolutely foundational components of treatment and recovery. But we can also use all these things that we have learned about how our genes influence risk as well, too, because they show up in dispositional factors that will allow us to intervene earlier. And so how does this actually show up? How can we put this research into practice? I talked earlier about all of these genetic testing companies that are coming online. And I will tell you that this is not just a hypothetical. This is coming to the addiction field as well. And so, in one of the more interesting and surprising twists and turns of my career, I was actually contacted over the last year by a company that is involved in how to essentially give back to the recovery community. And so Unchained Brands is a heavy metal rock and roll accessory company. That was a surprising email to get from the CEO. Some of you all will recognize this is Slash from Guns N' Roses, who had a very public battle with addiction. Essentially, it was formed by a group of individuals. The founders had both lost their fathers to alcohol use disorder. They were also musicians. One of them developed problems and is now in recovery. The other one never did. But they both cared very much and teamed up with a variety of musicians to develop these heavy metal accessory chains and earrings and necklaces and whatnot. And they give all of the proceeds to MusiCares, which is the nonprofit that's associated with the Grammys. And one of their causes is supporting families with loved ones who are struggling with addiction. And the feedback that the co-founders, shown here on either slide of Slash, kept getting is, I wish I could have known. I wish I could have known that my loved one was at risk. And so this led them to think, actually, how would we build out a company to get in front of this? Not to be raising money to give back to support families who are struggling, but how do we actually prevent this? And this led them to find and reach out to me. And so in terms of what we are actually can do right now, we know a lot about genetic risk. I was presenting some of that data right now, earlier today. We can take a saliva sample and we can create genetic risk scores for anyone here. They are not highly predictive in and of themselves, which is why they're not in clinical practice. They won't be anytime soon. And also because genes alone are just part of the story, even if we had found all of the genes. The environment is a critical piece. But via a saliva sample, we can create genetic risk scores. We know a lot about how genes influence risk. What are the early behavioral factors that indicate someone is at elevated risk? Things like impulsivity, risk-taking, anxiety proneness. In addition, we know a lot about what environments put people at risk. And so essentially, you can combine all of this information, genetics, take a short survey to figure out behavioral and environmental factors to help people understand their risk estimates. And in fact, that's what we're working on right now. So this is not purely science fiction. This is actually something that's in development. And the whole idea and the reason that I am interested in being involved in this is because I believe it's coming. It's coming with or without us scientists. Genetic advances are being driven not by the medical community, but by the private sector. And if scientists are not a part of that, it's going to be developed independent of the science. Because I strongly believe that, one, we have to do it right in terms of helping people understand what genetic risk means and doesn't mean, and how the environment plays a key role in that. And importantly, we don't just want to tell somebody they're at risk. We want to connect them to resources, evidence-based resources, to reduce risk. And that's exactly what we would be working on. Because the key here is that dispositions are important, but they're not destiny. And so we sometimes say, your genes are not your fault, and they're not your fate. But by knowing something about your genetic risk, we can use that information to help people prevent problems and accentuate their strengths. And so if you're interested, I'd point you toward my personal website, danielledick.com, where I put blogs and other information that's intended to be public-facing for general audiences about addiction, about genetic risk, to help people understand this, because I think we have to do far more in terms of educating the public. And on the resources piece, there's actually a survey, too, that comes out of the research world, and it essentially helps individuals identify where they fall on some of these genetically influenced dispositional factors, these externalizing and these internalizing factors, these risk-taking and impulsivity, anxiety proneness, negative thinking, that you can use right now to help people have discussions about this. Because one of the things that we know is if you only treat the substance rather than thinking about underlying risk factors, that in fact that underlying risk disposition can show up in other ways. And so an individual might reduce their substance use, but instead it might show up in risky eating patterns or in gambling or other kinds of manifestations of that sort of risky disposition. And so I think that by understanding the genetic component, it also helps us think holistically about how we support treatment and recovery. In conclusion, genetics is a really important piece of why some individuals are more at risk than others. And by understanding how genetic predispositions influence pathways of risk, it allows us to do more tailored prevention, intervention, treatment, and support recovery. So with that, I thank you for your time. This is where you can find me and additional resources. As was mentioned at the very beginning, my pandemic project was that I wrote a book. This is not a scientific book. This is me as a parent writing for other parents, because I found myself raising that impulsive, highly emotional, the risky child that I study. And the research was so helpful in helping me keep my sanity. And I realized how many other parents don't have access to this information. That when their children are struggling, they think, what am I doing wrong? What should I be doing differently? And so it's really about how kids' behavior is influenced by their genes, not just your parenting. And so the idea is to help reduce some of that guilt and burden that family members sometimes take on themselves, but also to recognize, how do you tailor your parenting to what's going to work best for different types of kids to help them bring out their strengths and embrace those dispositions and reduce potential pitfalls. So if you're interested, you can find the book on Amazon or at childcode.com, along with a whole series of resources that I have on my website. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.